The neon sign of the 7-Eleven buzzed with a dying, electrical hum. Under its flickering light, two men stood on the cracked pavement of Hell's Kitchen. One was short, wearing a thick coat, looking impatient. The other was a giant, a hulking, broad-shouldered man with a face that looked like a bruised peach. Swollen eyelids, a crooked mouth, and eyes that were red, not from a fight, but from crying. This was Sylvester Stallone. But not the one you know. This wasn't the millionaire who smoked cigars on yachts. This was a 29-year-old failure with exactly $0 in his bank account. Between them sat a bull mastiff. His name was Butkus. He was big, slobbery, and looked up at Stallone with absolute, unconditional adoration. He didn't know that his leash was being held by a hand that was trembling with shame. "Here," Stallone whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the city traffic. He shoved the leash toward the stranger. "Just take him before I change my mind." The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of crumpled bills. $25. That was the price. Stallone didn't count it. He couldn't. Looking at the money felt like looking at blood on his hands. He had just sold his only friend for the price of a few sandwiches. Most people think the Rocky story begins in the ring. It doesn't. It begins right here on this dirty sidewalk, where a man had to break his own heart just to survive the night. To understand why a man would sell his dog, you have to smell the apartment he came from. It was a shoebox above a subway station. The walls were thin as paper. The heating had been cut off weeks ago. The air inside smelled of stale sweat, hopelessness, and the metallic scent of poverty. Stallone was living the American nightmare. He had a pregnant wife, Sasha, who was sleeping under 3 blankets just to keep warm. They had no food in the fridge. Literally none. Hollywood had rejected him. Every casting director said the same thing. "You talk funny. Your eyes are droopy. You look like a thug." He had been kicked out of thousands of offices. He had sold his wife's jewelry. He had even starred in an adult film just to pay the rent a few years prior. But now he had hit a wall. There was nothing left to sell. Except Butkus. Butkus wasn't just a dog. In a world that told Stallone he was ugly, stupid, and worthless, Butkus was the only living thing that looked at him like he was a king. Stallone would sit on the floor, reading his scripts out loud, and Butkus would listen, thumping his tail. He was his audience, his critic, his best friend. But love doesn't buy milk. As Stallone looked at his pregnant wife shivering in her sleep, he realized a terrifying truth. He couldn't afford to love anymore. He had to make a choice between his past, the dog, and his future, the baby. The decision wasn't made with a grand speech. It was made in silence. Stallone stood up. He put on his coat, which had holes in the pockets. He grabbed the leash. "Come on, boy," he whispered. Butkus jumped up, tail wagging, thinking they were going for a walk. He didn't know it was a one-way trip. They walked out into the biting New York winter. The wind cut through Stallone's clothes like a knife. Every step was a battle. Stallone wanted to turn around. He wanted to run back upstairs, hug the dog, and starve together. But the hunger in his stomach was a sharp, physical pain. He needed cash. Fast. He walked toward the liquor store near the 7-Eleven. He knew people there had cash. He stood outside, shivering. He started asking strangers, "You want a dog? He's a good dog." Can you imagine the humiliation? A grown man, begging strangers to buy his best friend. Most people ignored him. Some laughed. "Get a job, bum." One man spat as he walked by. Stallone stood there for hours. His hands were freezing, but he didn't wear gloves because he didn't own any. Butkus sat by his feet, leaning his heavy head against Stallone's leg, offering warmth. That simple gesture almost broke him. Then a man stopped. He was short, named Little Jimmy. He looked at the dog, then at the desperate giant holding the leash. He smelled the desperation, and like a shark, he knew he could get a deal. "Nice dog," the stranger said. blowing smoke into the cold air. "Yeah," Stallone choked out. "He's the best. I can't keep him. I need $50. The stranger laughed. A cruel, dry laugh. "50? For that mutt? I'll give you 10. Stallone felt a surge of rage. He wanted to punch the man. He wanted to scream that this mutt was worth more than the stranger's entire life. But he couldn't afford rage. "Please," Stallone said. His voice cracked. "My wife. We need food." 40. 20, the stranger countered, pulling out a thin roll of bills. 30. "Please." 25. "Take it or leave it." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Stallone looked down at Butkus. The dog blinked, brown eyes full of trust. Stallone looked at the dirty $25 in the man's hand. It was enough for a week of groceries. It was survival. "Okay," Stallone whispered. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "Okay." The exchange happened. The money touched Stallone's palm. The leash left his hand. The connection was severed. The stranger tugged the leash. "Come on, mutt." Butkus resisted. He planted his feet. He looked back at Stallone. He whined. A high-pitched, confused sound that tore through the noise of the street. "Why aren't you coming? Why are you leaving me?" Stallone turned away. He couldn't watch. He pulled his collar up to hide his face, not from the cold, but from the shame. He started walking fast, then running. He ran until his lungs burned. He ran until he couldn't hear the dog whining anymore. But the sound of that whine would haunt him. Stallone returned to the apartment. The silence hit him like a physical blow. Usually, Butkus would be there to greet him, his heavy paws clacking on the floorboards. Now there was just the empty space near the heater where the dog used to sleep. Sasha, his wife, looked at him. She saw the empty leash. She didn't ask. The misery in the room was so thick you could choke on it. That night, Stallone didn't sleep. He couldn't. The guilt of selling his best friend was eating him alive. He needed a way out. He needed a miracle. 2 weeks later, he watched a boxing match. A nobody named Chuck Wepner was fighting the great Muhammad Ali. Wepner was losing, bleeding, getting battered, but he kept coming forward. He wouldn't fall. Something snapped in Stallone's brain. He ran home. He sat down at a small, wobbly table. He put a sheet of paper into his typewriter. He began to write. He didn't write like a professional. He wrote like a man possessed. He wrote for 3 days straight. He painted the windows of his bedroom black so he wouldn't know if it was day or night. He survived on cheap coffee and adrenaline. The clacking of the typewriter keys was the only sound in the apartment. Clack, clack, clack. It sounded like gunfire. He poured all his frustration, his hunger, the shame of the liquor store transaction onto the page. He created a character who was a bum, a nobody, someone who just wanted to go the distance. He named him Rocky Balboa. In 72 hours, the script was done. But writing it was the easy part. The real fight was about to begin. Stallone walked into the production offices of Irwin Winkler and Robert Chartoff. He had holes in his shoes and a script in his hand. He looked like a beggar, but he was about to play the highest-stakes poker game in Hollywood history. The producers read the script. They loved it. They called Stallone back in. The air in the office was smelling of expensive leather and opportunity. "We want it," they said. "We'll give you $25,000. For a man with $0, this was a fortune. It was enough to buy food, pay rent, buy the dog back. But Stallone shook his head. "I play Rocky." The producers laughed. They looked at his drooping eyelids, his crooked mouth, his slur. "No," they said. "You're a writer. We want a star. We want Ryan O'Neal. We want Burt Reynolds. We want James Caan." They raised the offer. $100,000. Stallone said no. $250,000. Stallone said no. Think about this moment. This man had a pregnant wife at home who was starving. He had sold his dog because he couldn't afford dog food. And now he was turning down $250,000. It was insanity. It was suicide. Finally, the offer hit $360,000. That is over $2 million in today's money. The producers pushed the check across the polished mahogany desk. "Take the money, kid. Go home. You'll never have to work again." Stallone looked at the check. He thought about the cold apartment. He thought about Butkus shivering with a stranger. But he knew something deep in his gut. If he took the money, he would be a rich man, but he would be a ghost. He would have sold his soul twice, once at the liquor store and once here. "I play Rocky," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Or no deal." The silence in the room was deafening. The producers looked at each other. They saw that this crazy kid wasn't bluffing. He was ready to walk out and starve rather than let someone else live his dream. They caved. They gave him the role, but they slashed the budget. They paid him peanuts for the script, $35,000 instead of $360,000. He didn't care. He had the money. As soon as the check cleared, Stallone didn't go to a car dealership. He didn't go to a fancy restaurant. He ran back to the 7-Eleven. He stood on that same cracked pavement where he had committed his greatest sin. He waited. 1 day passed. The stranger didn't show. 2 days. Stallone was sweating. Had the man moved? Was Butkus gone forever? On the 3rd day he saw him, little Jimmy, and walking beside him, looking a bit thinner but still strong, was Butkus. Stallone's heart hammered against his ribs. He ran over. "I want him back," Stallone said, breathless. "I made a mistake. Please." But little Jimmy wasn't stupid. He saw the desperation in Stallone's eyes. He saw the new clothes. He smelled the money. "He's not for sale," Jimmy said. "My kids love him now. I sold him to you for $25. Stallone pleaded. "I'll give you $100. "No." $500. "No." $1,000. The negotiation on that street corner was tougher than the one in the studio. Jimmy knew he held Stallone's heart on a leash. Stallone kept raising the price. He wasn't paying for a dog anymore. He was paying for his redemption. Finally, Jimmy named his price. $15,000. Stallone didn't blink. He didn't haggle. He handed over almost half of his paycheck from the movie. $15,000 for a dog he sold for $25. He grabbed the leash. Butkus looked up, recognized him, and jumped. The giant dog nearly knocked Stallone over, licking his face, forgiving him instantly. Stallone buried his face in the dog's neck and wept. This time they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of wholeness. Stallone didn't just buy the dog back. He put him in the movie. If you watch Rocky, the dog that runs with him, that's Butkus. The dog that sits in the cage while Rocky talks to Adrian, that's Butkus. He wasn't a prop. He was the only cast member who had been there when Rocky was just a starving writer in a cold apartment. Stallone even gave little Jimmy a small part in the movie just to close the deal. When Rocky won Best Picture at the Oscars, Stallone stood on the stage in a tuxedo. The world saw a champion. But when he went home that night, he didn't sleep with the trophy. He slept next to a snoring bullmastiff. Because the Oscar was just gold-plated metal. But the dog? The dog was the reason he was still alive. Sylvester Stallone bet on himself when the odds were 360,000 to 1. And he won. But not every Hollywood gamble ends in victory. Sometimes the bet is fatal. If you think the story of Rocky was intense, wait until you hear the tragic, cursed story of Brandon Lee on the set of The Crow. A gun that was supposed to be empty, a crew that was too tired to check, and a mistake that can never be undone. Click here to watch the story of the shot that silenced Hollywood forever. And remember, everyone has a price. What's yours?